Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 10th chapter of the third book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, the title being Stratagem. The text follows. Stratagem implies a concealed intention and therefore is opposed to straightforward dealing, in the same way as wit is the opposite of direct proof. It has therefore nothing in common with means of persuasion, of self-interest, of force, but a great deal to do with deceit, because that likewise conceals its object. It is itself a deceit as well when it is done, but still it differs from what is commonly called deceit, in this respect that there is no direct breach of word. The deceiver by stratagem leaves it to the person himself whom he is deceiving to commit the errors of understanding which at last, flowing into one result, suddenly change the nature of things in his eyes. We may therefore say, as wit is a sleight of hand with ideas and conceptions, so stratagem is a sleight of hand with actions. At first sight it appears as if strategy had not improperly derived its name from stratagem, and that, with all the real and apparent changes which the whole character of war has undergone since the time of the Greeks, this term still points to its real nature. If we leave to tactics the actual delivery of the blow, the battle itself, and look upon strategy as the art of using these means with skill, then besides the forces of the character, such as burning ambition which always presses like a spring, a strong will which hardly bends, etc., there seems no subjective quality so suited to guide and inspire strategic activity as stratagem. The general tendency to surprise, treated of in the foregoing chapter, points to this conclusion, for there is a degree of stratagem, be it ever so small, which lies at the foundation of every attempt to surprise. But however much we feel a desire to see the actors in war outdo each other in hidden activity, readiness and stratagem, still we must admit that these qualities show themselves but little in history and have rarely been able to work their way to the surface from amongst the mass of relations and circumstances. The explanation of this is obvious, and it is almost identical with the subject matter of the preceding chapter. Strategy knows no other activity than the regulating of combat with the measures which to relate to it. It has no concern, like ordinary life, with the transactions which consist merely of words, that is, in expressions, declarations, etc., but these which are very inexpensive are chiefly the means with which the wily one takes into those he practices upon. That which there is like it in war, plans and orders given merely as make-believers, false reports sent on purpose to the enemy, is usually of so little effect in the strategic field that is only resorted to in particular cases which offer of themselves, therefore cannot be regarded as spontaneous action which emanates from the leader. But such measures as carrying out the arrangements for a battle so far as to impose upon the enemy require a considerable expenditure of time and power. Of course, the greater the impression to be made, the greater the expenditure in these respects. And as this is usually not given for the purpose, very few demonstrations, so-called in strategy, effect the object for which they are designed. In fact, it is dangerous to detach large forces for any length of time, merely for a trick, because there is always the risk of its being done in vain, and then these forces are wanted at the decisive point. The chief actor in war is always thoroughly sensible of this sober truth, and therefore he has no desire to play at tricks of agility. The bitter earnestness of necessity presses so fully into direct action that there is no room for that game. In a word, the pieces on the strategical chessboard want that mobility which is the element of stratagem and subtlety. The conclusion which we draw in that a correct and penetrating eye is a more necessary and more useful quality for a general than for craftiness, although that also does no harm if it does not exist at the expense of necessary qualities of the heart, which is only too often the case. But the weaker the forces become, which are under the command of strategy, so much more they become adapted for stratagem, so that the quite feeble and little, for whom no prudence, no sagacity is any longer sufficient, to the point where all art seems to forsake him, stratagem offers itself as a last resource. The more helpless his situation, the more everything presses towards one single, desperate blow, the more readily stratagem comes to the aid of his boldness, let loose from all further calculations, freed from all concern for the future. Boldness and stratagem intensify each other, and thus collect at one point an infinitesimal glimmering of hope into a single ray, which may likewise serve to kindle a flame. So this is an interesting chapter that von Clausewitz writes with much in parallel, I would say, at least in the core concept, with what we have seen in the previous one about surprise, and yet distinguishes, of course, stratagems from surprise proper, but in fact we see that there is always a little bit of surprise stratagems implied. So stratagem implies a concealed intention and therefore is opposed to straightforward dealing, in the same way as wit is the opposite of direct proof. Right. So there is essentially an element of, properly of concealment, right? Not of much of a direct action we could think in a straightforward sense, right? But something that we have basically to lure our enemy into, right? And it owns in this regard a sort of intuitive character that is different, in fact, from the, I would say, mechanical logic of strengths. Strengths forces that have to be more than else strength of forces. That is usually what, as we will see now, in fact brings the same possibilities of stratagem down in a way, right? Because they are instead more direct evidence, right? And the greater they are, the more difficult it is to escape essentially from their logic in the specific context. And therefore there is, if you want, an element of not of naivety, right, of wrongdoing in the stratagem in terms of the military art. This can help, as we will see, and we have already read now. But at the same time, the chances to apply this successfully are often done at the expense of probably other opportunities, right? That there is always a loss, right? If you're going to lure the enemy in a certain situation, you're in a way betting on something that, if it doesn't produce itself, may backfire on you. And we have seen it still with surprise in the previous chapter. But this is still very balanced. This is not to say that stratagem is a negative thing, right? It could be even, a resolutive thing, but simply there are less chances to do it, right? And we will see why. Von Clausewitz writes, it has therefore nothing in common with means of persuasion or of self-interest or force, but a great deal to do with deceit, because that likewise conceals its object, right? There is this, if you want, intentional dimension within which stratagem fares, right? It's not about trying to show the enemy something that is not true, but fundamentally attracting the enemy into a situation that can be exploited in a certain way, and that he doesn't realize as such, right? It concealing just the object, right? Not the reality per se. Von Clausewitz writes, it is itself a deceit as well when it is done, but it still differs from what is commonly called deceit, in this respect that there is no direct breach of word. The deceiver by stratagem leaves it to the person himself whom he is deceiving to commit the errors of understanding, which at last, flowing to one result, suddenly change the nature of things in his eyes, right? in a way, it's stratagems could be adopted broadly meant. It is important also about the etymology of stratagem, that is quite neutral after all, right? A stratagem has gotten into a sort of negative acception in our, but this is not really the point. I mean, there will be interesting historical implications to this, seeing how the term originated, to what military context, but and the importance here is essentially making the enemy scramble, right? The idea is that the situation may even be evident, but if the enemy is failing to recognize it by himself, right? So you don't have necessarily faked it more than you may not even intentionally obtain that, right? Still, this thing is going to have a sudden change at one point when the enemy figures out, and that disorientation can naturally be exploited by yourself. Clausewitz writes, "We may therefore say, as knit is a sleight of hand with ideas and conceptions, so stratagem is a sleight of hand with actions." Right? While there is a sort of ability of we have seen not much of persuasion, but essentially of presenting a face that doesn't reveal automatically what the broader implications of itself are. That is, you don't have to fake necessarily with an enemy to present a situation that can trick him into it, right? You have to simply let the enemy commit the mistake by yourself. Von Clausewitz writes, "At first sight it appears as if strategy had not improperly derived its name from stratagem, and that, with all the real and apparent changes which the whole character of war has undergone since the time of the Greeks, this term still points to its real nature." So there is a properly constant dimension in strategy that pertains to the stratagem itself, right? They're actually the same, they're expression of the same thing, right? Or better, stratagem pertains to strategy inherently, right? Like, we'll see better how this also connects with surprise, as we've seen, because there is always a pinch of surprise in the matter, as in any military action, not just in stratagems. This is why von Clausewitz is stressing also that conversely, strategy is containing the surprise. Strategy is containing stratagems, and stratagems contain definitely surprise themselves. And then von Clausewitz writes, "If we leave to tactics the actual delivery of the blow, the battle itself, and look upon strategy as the art of using this means with skill, right? Then besides the forces of the character, such as burning ambition which always presses like a spring, a strong will which hardly bends, etc., there seems no subjective quality so suited to guide and inspire strategic activity as stratagem." Right? That is, if you leave aside, abstractly, what could be the motivation, right? What really pushes to so the moral forces per se, in terms of the strength that they confer to your armed forces, for their military virtue or the ability of the commander. Stratagem is in a way shifting the not properly shifting, but given that we have given this abstract picture, at least trying to in this sense play on the deceit of the enemy, right? Whichever this happens like properly. Because von Clausewitz writes that the general tendency to surprise, treated of in the foregoing chapter, points to this conclusion, for there is a degree of stratagem, but it ever so small, which lies at the foundation of every attempt to surprise. But however much we feel desire to see the actors in war outdo each other in hidden activity, readiness and stratagem, still we must admit that these qualities show themselves but little in history, right? And have rarely been able to work their way to the surface from amongst the mass of relations and circumstances, right? There is this, idea that you could constantly try to, to conceal the enemy as much intentions of yours you want, right? And this would naturally imply to, to have a conservative attitude more than else, and invest in a lot in this kind of not much of avoidable combat, but let's say trying to bring the enemy into a situation that he can trick himself. And this always happens, but at the same time, it's not the prevailing mover, right? That's why before von Clausewitz has abstracted it from the moral strength that brings people to fight for whichever reason in a particular way. And then von Clausewitz writes that the explanation of this is obvious, and it is almost identical with the subject matter of preceding chapter. Indeed, right? We have already explained, right? There is essentially a dimension in surprise and in stratagems that cost, right? And in order to be effective, in order to really being able to fool someone that essentially is fighting at similar odds with you and that can potentially do the same thing, at some point it's useless to pretend, first of all, that all of these ruses are going to work, right? Because simply most of the times they're gonna not, or at least they will just in a minimal sense, right? How can you trick, like on a broader strategical dimension, the enemy to commit an enormous mistake? It rarely happens, historically speaking, right? This can happen for mostly for reasons that are even beyond the same military dimension, right? It can be a from political move, but from a strictly military point of view, the idea that a direct attack is on average less effective of a stratagem, say an ambush, is show me this in the reality of warfare, show me how many wars have been won by ambushes, and compared to the ones that have been won by simply going there, destroying the enemy forces, openly and getting it, right? Now, this is very important. And it's not by quoting one example or two or three or even 10 that you revert the thing. I mean, the proportion is overwhelmingly shifted towards the simplicity. There are certain principles of war. I mean, I actually never made a video about them, but this has to do with essentially this economy of forces that is what the same offensive mean is conceived to be employed like, right? Preserving your forces to try to obtain something else most of the times will also burn away resources, but not much just in the in the effect, in their material force, but in the effectiveness this is gonna have on the enemy, because the enemy tendentially will not fall for it, and you will run out of even a will. The enemy also will not be pressed immediately enough, so complexively you will have actually a lesser impact. You will fundamentally drive away from the culminating point of the fight. That is what you should be searching for by committing en masse, as we have seen it in the second chapter before this about the superiority of forces. That is really the deal, right? You can't, on average, you can't pretend to fight a war by preserving your forces, right? The more you are able to commit, right, the better the thing is going to go. Naturally, this must be coupled with an adequate, determination and availability of resources, but war should be fought primarily, if possible, by striking the hardest in the quickest way as possible. Right? The rest is tendentially going to evolve in a loss of time, and the fact that this doesn't happen in reality has literally nothing to do with what should be in theory. Right? The fact that in reality we have spent the whole second chapter looking at this, the first book looking at this stuff, is that there is an infinity of friction in the process. So sometimes you simply can't do that, right? But still, in the way you do it, there is a way to do it and another way to do it, right? Then von Clausewitz says strategy knows no other activity than the regulating of combat with the measures which relate to it. Strategy has to employ the moral and physical strengths in a way they can be profitable in combat, hopefully a decisive one, tendentially decisive one, because also in here there is not such thing like a decisive battle, if not the last of the war, right? Doesn't matter how important it is compared to others, extrapolated from the strategical context, but this is another thing we have discussed already in the previous chapters. We will not be doing it now. Then von Clausewitz says it has no concern, like ordinary life, with transactions which consist merely of words, that is, in expressions, declarations, etc. But these, which are very inexpensive, are chiefly the means with which the wily one takes into those he practices upon. Right, so what von Clausewitz is saying here is that you can't essentially fool an enemy in war like you would do like with an individual in real life through dialectics, let's say. The broader picture here has to do with the best option you can have at the moment, right, in terms of actual employment of force, right? So in other words, you can't fool someone just with a merely, for example, exhibition of your intentions, because the enemy is going to arrive there with force, is going to crush you. Right? This is something you don't see very often, at least directly in human, in individual relations. At least not very often, indeed, in real life. While in war, this is fundamentally all about it, right? And this is happening at on a much larger scale. So at this point, you can't, the way the enemy is going to strike in this sense is not going to follow this merely declaratory, courtly, polite intent. The enemy is simply going to crush you. That's what he wants to do, right? He is going to hammer you hard until you give up, right? And there are certain ways to channel this force that do not look at, in fact, mere talk, right? So what stratagems is also are left to is this dimension where the enemy has mainly to decide where to channel his own forces, right? But this does not make you avoid the enemy to pass you by in that sense, to avoid combat, to avoid your forces clashing. So what stratagems are aimed at is essentially, from a properly strategical point of view, to present a tactically favorable, also strategically favorable situation that can allow you, however, to strike, right, in a way that the enemy had not thought of, right? That can even really happen under sunlight, right? It is not really about concealing something physical in here, at least not necessarily. That also always happens in a way or another, because you basically never know what the enemy is really about, also in terms of strength at all time. But this is evidently much more effective in this perceptual dimension, this intuitional dimension, where you are guessing essentially what is the enemy up to at that point and how he's going to react to my blow. This is particularly important, because albeit this perceptual, let's say, this would-be dimension can objectively, has a lot of room, has more room than what you're seeing in reality. Reality is actually crashing this room, right? And the dynamics through which war moves largely leave less option for this, cheaper ideas that are, in a way, even more complex and demanding to to enact in reality than what the idea of the trick would fundamentally make you presume. Then von Clausewitz writes, that which there is like it in war, plans and orders given merely as make-believers, false reports sent on purpose to the enemy, is usually of so little effect in the strategic field that is only resorted to. In particular cases which offer of themselves, there cannot be regarded as spontaneous action which emanates from the leader. Right. So there is also, let's say, a dimension of stratagems that basically emerges a little bit by themselves, right? It's stemming from this hardcore reality. It sometimes presents with options to fool the enemy after all, because the whole thing about war, it's a very complex system, so you can always find room for these actions to take place. But still, it's not the prevalent mover. It's not by sheer convenience of economy of force is what you will encounter more frequently, or at least that will have the habitually the greater importance over other kinds of decision. In fact, von Clausewitz writes, but such measures as carrying out the arrangements for a battle as far to impose upon the enemy require considerable expenditure of time and power, as we were saying before. And of course, the greater the impression to be made, the greater the expenditure in these respects. So, as we have seen for the surprise, yes, you can, work a lot. We've seen that surprise requires actually create the sense of duty and an energetic character to enact, right? You can't surprise an enemy without, in fact, pushing your forces towards this more difficult, if you want, natural situation. That's something that requires a much greater pressure to be enacted. But this pressure has a cost. So there's always a balance you have to take into account in here. And, if you stress it too much, you can, work very hard for creating a very sophisticated plan, trying to make it work, and it will not work. One of the classical principles of warfare is simplicity. And this stems exactly from this, the fact that, at another level, basically meeting the enemy, in a kind of symmetrical condition, face to face, is the best way to fight after all. The most direct way to settle the matter. Right? Even in terms of costs for he who is going to be defeated, at least in terms of what is going to be burned militarily speaking, then of course this could be the end of our entire country, entire people, that can be not worth it. But in many ways, that is most of the times the best way to fight. And you see what happens in here is that this is obviously to be decided by politics, and in history, in reality, what you see is that if the conditions to meet the enemy face to face is presenting such unfavorable odds, the war itself is not going to take place, right? So what you can hope to do in a victory, to achieve a victory, considering the costs of this victory, is to try to bring the thing down to the simplest thing. And it's obvious that in this surprise stratagems are not usually the best option, right? And this has naturally, as we've just said, say usually on average, it's not per se has an absolute value, right, on average. But naturally, in reality, there are many contexts in which this tends to differ. Of course, even in there, realizing that this is on average still true, right? Even in guerrilla warfare, there is a logic that, at that smaller, if you want, level of action and command, is mirroring fundamentally even the difficulties that happen at a larger scale level, right? When of course the others also resorts to guerrilla and fills the this gap of this asymmetry, which is what all armies tend to do at every single time, right? It wide to abstractions in regarding questions about military systems abstracted for their context would clash like it are senseless is that properly, if those two forces met, since the first time, they would immediately fight in a different way from what those military systems were used to, because they would have to fill the asymmetry, tendentially, to fill the gap, right, of that asymmetry. And this is why, as we've seen it also in the previous chapter, and here one recurs, these actions, this resource, these stratagems are, together with surprise, something that rarely has an importance in this history of warfare. Once again, this has nothing to do with the fact that were great ambushes, that were great defeats brought by stratagems, and the stratagems are always there. But if you really look, it's always what we were saying also last time. This is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because if at the base there hadn't been, this broader amount of moral and material forces, you operating in a certain context, you couldn't even find yourself in the situation to use that stratagem. So the stratagem per se is not the answer, right? This is just a secondary product, right, of a much broader logic that you ought better follow, right, and that reality forces you to follow actually at all times with constant, very hard lessons that show you constantly that driving straight from it, including exceeding with stratagems or surprises, is exactly what we're talking about. And von Clausewitz then writes, and as this is usually not given for the purpose, very few demonstrations, so-called in strategy, affect the object for which they are designed. In fact, it is dangerous to detach large forces for any length of time merely for a trick, because there is always the risk of it's being done in vain, and then these forces are wanted at the decisive point. We've seen the importance of the decisive point. Why do you keep forces away when you approach the decisive point? You won't make this trick, you don't even know how the whole thing is going to unfold, and you add essentially, this is also important, you basically add an element of unpredictability in creating overly complicated plans, tactics, and ruses, stratagems. Right, you are paying for it, and if you're paying for it, you must know what risks are in this regard, what you're doing it for, exactly. And sometimes it could even be worth it. It could be worth it. It's just that on average, it is not worth it, right? And that the situation, in a way, calls for it when it's needed, right? It doesn't need this great artificiality, this great, sophisticated reasoning, right? Because we have seen that in practice, you can't resolve the thing like that, right? This is not a positive or determined system that that you can sort out easily, right? This is why von Clausewitz says, these stratagems are, calling for themselves, right, when the option arises, right? And that's where you have to be able to exploit them, but not thinking that essentially warfare is based on. It's mostly stratagems that are floating over the broader logic of war, broader dynamics of war, and of course their logics. Then von Clausewitz writes, the chief actor in war is always thoroughly sensible of this sober truth, right? And therefore he has no desire to play at tricks of agility. This is also very important that you remember that Pression I was telling you, those hard lessons that I was talking to you about before, but this is exactly the point. And when you're commanding an army, the thing you're constantly impacted by is fear, fundamentally, that things will go wrong, because guess what? Things go increasingly wrong. The more pressure increases, and therefore when you have to meet the enemy at the highest, right, and therefore the least thing you're thinking at in those conditions is exactly stratagems, these tricks of agility, right? That is something you can do if you want to experiment a bit, right? And this is also when disasters sometimes happen, because you can afford them in a way, right? This has to do largely also with the economy of forces, right? And of course with the broader motivation of the whole thing. For Clausewitz writes, the bitter earnestness of necessity possesses so fully into direct action that there is no room for that game. Right? This is really something that rarely brings you not to think of. Most of the times, in a word, Von Clausewitz writes, the pieces on the strategical chessboard want that mobility, which is the element of stratagem and subtlety. Right? That is really what allows you to achieve that level of surprise on the enemy that you really need to win. Right? This is having more strength, more motivation, bringing forces together more easily, more quickly for your objective at the decisive point. If you're able to do this, you have been already able to amaze the enemy, right? What was necessary to, and of course this can ever be improved, right? So that what is this in the first place? We've seen for Clausewitz, after all, the enemy is not going to be amazed that easily in this way. But still, that is the more effective way of really catching him, let's say, by surprise, right? By his own surprise, by the fact that he didn't think you were so well organized, so well determined to achieve what you want. And that's where the thing always goes down to, that the war is a clash between moral forces. That's the first thing. It's not about how much material you have. If you're not going to bring it on the table at the decisive point, right? It's about the moral forces. It is about the moral forces. Just like in single duels, like just in war, who wins is usually the more intelligent, but is also the more motivated, right? And it doesn't matter which means he uses, but it's the motivation, right, that tends to feel that gap, that if he's at the disadvantage is used, is gonna look for, but always giving this picture from the side of the disadvantage, right? But that's exactly what you really want, and there are so many implications in here that have to do even with still the moral motivation, the pressure that the disadvantage has, that that tends to balance the odds in this regard, primarily from a moral point of view. Then von Clausewitz writes, the conclusion which we draw is that a correct and penetrating eye is a more necessary, more useful quality for a general than craftiness, although that also does no harm if it does exist at the expense of necessary qualities of the art, which is only too often the case, right? It is, unfortunately, it's difficult to find people who are really, intelligent, cold, determined, that do not lose their mind, know what to do at every, at every moment. It's easier to find people who are very prudent, too prudent, that maybe are very, industrious, that, they're able to prepare themselves, but that they don't have that punching element. But let's say that it's this coup d'oeil, right? This penetrating eye is more important than that, right? It has to do with a capacity not to store for the winter, but to settle the matter before winter is coming. Right, this is exactly the point, right? You can't do. There is always a better option, that where quantity is not necessarily quality. That being prudent is fine. There is also in their way, a mediocre standard where you can, rest on. But still, there is going to be the person that is more cut for that job and will do better than you, and you will remain like, what did I go wrong? Well, you didn't look far enough at the point in which you were, right? And most of the times it's because you didn't dare enough. It's because you didn't put yourself under that same pressure. It makes you look more far necessarily if you want to remain afloat, right? So this is really very important, because it makes you understand also in terms of personal achievements what is. That's something, I don't know, personally in life I've always felt very much that sometimes you do things more for anxiety of failure, that because you're really determined to get the thing, right? This is not excessively good. I mean, you can question when does one thing begins and the other ends, right? Because sometimes it's difficult, because for Von Clausewitz, as we have seen, the moral force is always kind of floating. Therefore, he's talking in asymptotic, absolute terms of what should be done, but naturally, human nature is always, changing, right? It's always unstable in many ways, and therefore you have also to believe in a way what you're doing, in following your intuition before even a careful planning that of course is needed as well. You couldn't go anywhere in that regard, but that still without vision, without intuition, could be wrong by itself. So this is a very deep point for the Vom Kriege. And then von Clausewitz writes, but the weaker the forces become, are under the command of strategy, so much the more they become adapted for stratagem, so that the quite feeble and little, for whom no prudence, no sagacity is any longer sufficient, at the point where all art seems to forsake him, stratagem offers itself as a last resource. This is also the point I actually wanted to digress on before, which is of radical importance. It has to do in the history of mankind with the dichotomy of David and Goliath, right? The idea that how can the small one, the giant, right? Which is something that often happens actually in warfare. Why? Because the small is under a greater pressure than the bigger, right? And therefore is much more determined even to make sacrifices, because he knows that otherwise, chances of making it are very slim, right? And that's what brings motivation, and that's what brings, paradoxically, the stratagem to be employed more easily. Hence, think about guerrilla warfare, right? Just to make a banal example, Vietnam War, right? Look at what the whole thing was about on the field, and see how, motivationally speaking, the thing eventually ended, and how it was fought and how it ended. And this naturally has to do with politics, but it's essentially the same thing, right? Because still there is a motivation that in the military that is not taken just from the military, it's taken from politics, it's taken from society. So this is really very important. The stratagems, that ambushes, that guerrilla, we could say, in that case, are more likely to be employed by David than Goliath. And even in the Bible, how does David fight? Well, of course, with a sling. Well, Goliath is the full infantryman, melee infantryman in full panoply, right? That's exactly the thing. That shows what can be achieved with this skill, with this desperate means, right? But there are also very dangerous in this regard. And why? Because slingers do not have much of a chance to take down an enemy that is covered in iron in hand-to-hand combat, right? Because they're usually very poor people, right? That just shepherds and have just a sling. But that's exactly what trains them to hit the enemy in the weakest point with this great ability that they're forced to develop in that sense to survive. That is hitting him straight, in that case, straight in the forehead and knocking him out with a single blow, right? And that's a deep metaphor, right? Then von Clausewitz says the more helpless is his situation, the more everything presses towards one single desperate blow. Oh, I didn't even read this. I swear I didn't remember this from before. That's the same blow, right? David's sling. And the more readily stratagem comes to the aid of his boldness, because he was bold, definitely, to fight against Goliath. So think about it, because this is really that imbalance, that asymmetry that is balanced is gapped with moral forces. It's not that David and Goliath's equipment changed in all this. It's just motivation and skill that made the difference, right? Right. And by the way, if you really want to start, the first single military manual in the history of mankind is exactly the Bible, right? If you want to read about war and this very important military logic, start from the Bible, because the Bible actually is an excellent military history read. Then von Clausewitz concludes by saying, let loose from all further calculations, freed from all concern for the future, boldness and stratagem intensify each other and thus collect at one point an infinitesimal glimmering of hope into a single ray, which may likewise serve to kindle a flame. Right? That is, essentially, don't think stratagem per se is, in the art of warfare, right, the dominating element, right? But at the same time, always remember it's there, that it always contributes, and that can even light up the flame of victory. And we've seen it in under which circumstances, especially. But from this chapter, what you have to maintain in mind is why and how you should be using stratagems, and not thinking that stratagem has an absolute value in every single situation, right? That you have to recur to it or don't recur to it, right? It all depends. Also because every damn situation changes, right? But just remember that it's unlikely. Okay, so for now, this is how it finishes. Next time we'll read Assembly of Forces in Space. Now these chapters are really pearls, right? And they're very important, and we're getting really in the heart of von Clausewitz thinking. Okay, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.